Hey guys, welcome to my short lecture on witchcraft in the anthropological sense. I thought I'd post this online since we're kind of running out of time in class, and I wanted you to get a little background in terms of how we think about witchcraft in the context of anthropology. So I'm quickly going to go over three definitions of witchcraft: the anthropological, the diabolical, and the neo-pagan, which I'll just briefly mention since our presentation this week will probably cover that a little bit more. And so in anthropology, when we think about a witch, we usually think of a negative aspect, someone who has an ability to do supernatural harm to others. In other words, this is an individual that not only will harm others in general, but specifically what makes a witch so frustrating and significant is that you're looking at an individual that might be considered harming neighbors and kin. So people that would be part of that circle of, trust and trustworthiness. So that's kind of one of the issues with witchcraft. Witches are often described as part of the society of evildoers, or, the opposite of right society, going against what's the social norm, what's socially acceptable. There you go. And also being regarded as social pollution. So usually this kind of concept of a witch is usually going against social norms, social values, moral code, status quo. This is an individual that is really kind of put on the opposite end of that. And really interesting thing that I want to mention now is that oftentimes historically, and you'll see cross-culturally, is that witches are often described as kind of taking the brunt of blame. So it's kind of a thing we describe called social projection. So there's fear in the society, there's problems in the society. Who are we going to blame? How can we project all the negativity that's going on one particular group? And we'll see historically for several hundred years it was the concept of accusing people as witches. Think about today, what is the group, what are the people in society that we often project all the bad things that are happening? It's because of them, it's because of these people that all these bad things are happening. And I can think of a couple of examples in modern times. So there's a difference between sometimes witchcraft and sorcery, and we'll see some examples in just a moment. But many times witchcraft explains crises. It explains when something bad happens, when misfortune happens. Usually the idea of sorcery versus witchcraft is that witchcraft can sometimes be involuntary, and we saw that with the Azande, and I'll mention that again, where sorcery and sorcerers will do intentional harm, like specifically wanting to do some of the things we talked about in the last couple weeks, causing harm, black magic, all those negative connotations that we've mentioned, and the variety of examples we've had with regards to, even New Orleans or Haitian voodoo that we've seen in class. Your chapter 10, talks about the idea of evil eye beliefs and folk beliefs associated with negative forces causing harm, and I'm going to probably try to cover this in class on Wednesday, but you'll see it's a widespread belief all over the world, usually tied to the concepts of jealousy and envy, and usually those that are victims to this negativity are people that are sometimes described as most vulnerable in society, children usually, and times of marriage or childbirth are the most vulnerable times, but we'll get into that next week. So I won't talk about the Azande very much because we already had a great example in class with our presenters, but if you recall, they discussed E. Evans Pritchard, who was the anthropologist who went to the Sudan and studied the Azande back in the early 20th century. As you recall, the Azande had a belief that witchcraft was inherited and that misfortune always happened because of witchcraft. And so just like that idea of social projection that I talked about in the beginning of this lecture, the same idea could be applied to the Azande, that witchcraft is basically taking the blame for when things go wrong. And if you recall from that great presentation that we had in class, the whole idea that witchcraft is meant for a way to keep people on the up and up, and it was a form of judgment, of moral judgment for the community. The group talked about the different oracles, a type of divination or foreseeing the future, or actually getting with answers, finding answers for things that happened, either where it was the poison or the termites or the rubbing board. Some of you guys probably remember all those wonderful examples that the group brought up. My next example I'll talk about is the Dobu, and the Dobu are from the South Pacific, and you'll see here a picture of Bronislaw Malinowski, who was mentioned in your textbook talking about magical practices studied in these areas of the Trobriand Islands where the Dobu are from, northern eastern part of, or coming from the Papua New Guinea right here. There you go. I can use my little, we're over here in these islands. Use lose my cursor. So the Dobu are from an island east of New Guinea. They were primarily grew their food. They were horticulturists, primarily root tubers like yams, and they had this idea of others were going to harm them and be harmful. And so there was fear of people in neighboring islands. This is different than some of the ideas we talked about in the cultural class, if you remember, when some native peoples would travel from island to island going on the Kula trades. This is a different idea. Back in the day, there was fear of cannibalism as a part of contagious magical practices and headhunting, and so there was a big fear of witchcraft amongst these people. As a side note, the Dobu were matrilineal. So what that means, and I think we mentioned this in class during one of the presentations, I can't, probably it was the voodoo presentation, I can't quite remember. Anyway, matrilineal systems are usually societies that have the family that traces descent down the mother's line, and so the mother side of the family is the one that's unifying, heads of the household, in charge of inheritance rules. And so for the Dobu, the idea of your matrilineal family, your matrilineage, is considered your suso. The word for suso means mother's milk, and so there was a strong link. So anybody in your suso is the people that you trust and the people that are going to look out for you and support you and be on your side. People that are outside of the matrilineage, then you got into issues where they could be mistrusted, and there was fear, jealousy, and suspicion of their actions, and this is where you got the supernatural forces come into play. Just like the Azande, there is no misfortunes or no concept of accidents amongst the Dobu, and so misfortunes resulted in terms of witchcraft, sorcery, or attack, and usually you had tribal raids based on either territory, resources, or mates specifically. And these photographs are all historical. As you can see, the areas have been pacified quite a bit in the mid to late 20th century. Sorcerers were usually males, and they claim to cause a particular illness. If someone suddenly dies or is very, very ill, usually it's a cause of sorcery amongst the Dobu. Sorcery usually can be identified, leaving some type of record or what should I say, proof that sorcery occurred, and usually males would take credit for that. Whereas witchcraft was associated with women, and women don't say anything about it, but the idea was that they could do it at night, leave no trace, and were also associated with changes in climates and weather. So women, because of these beliefs, weren't tied to the Kula journeys of traveling from island to island in the canoes because they could cause bad weather. So women were really not part of that system at all. So just a couple of ideas there, cultural practices. Diabolical witchcraft is really associated with the reign of Satan and the anti or pre-Christian ideas of interpretation and worship. This is a little bit different than the presentations last week, as we learned the Church of Satan are actually not associated with the devil or Satan worshiping, using Satan as an image or as a symbol for self-reliance and independence. Whereas here, diabolical witchcraft was really a statement of going against Christianity, which is described as heresy. And this whole interpretation of this diabolical or worship of Satan, again, taking the world upside down, taking opposite of right society, once again, from that first slide. So overview of the witch trials, we won't get into it too much, but you have it in chapter 10. You see that, lots of time of suspicion and difficulties during the Black Plague. Getting into the 15 and 1600s in Europe, you had organized witch hunts. You had the publication of the Malleus Maleficarium, which is associated with describing what witchcraft was, and then getting into the colonies, of course, the Salem witch trials. I just noticed there's a new show called Salem, so I don't know if that's any good. This lasted a couple hundred years, and all of a sudden it disappeared with the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment, where social thinkers, a greater sense of science taking over the understanding of the world over Christian beliefs, and you saw this kind of just disappear and people focusing elsewhere. So there you go. There's an example of the Malleus Maleficarium, where it's describing witchcraft as a form of magic, where with the help of a demon, one man can injure another. So that's, again, magical, but with specific harm, intent to harm. So the image of the witch is usually associated with representing people's deepest fears. representing a reversal of norms, so that opposite of what is right and good and understood and safe. And so again, you have this idea of social projection, which I often think about. Who are the witches today? Who are we persecuting today? As saying that they are the cause and the blame to the negativity and bad things that happen in life. So traditionally, the view of the witch, it was associated with, females. Again, you can't escape, original sin, and Eve kind of ruined it for everybody. You had women more associated with primal, natural. You had menstruation, you had childbirth, and so there was a more animal quality to women. Women with nature, men culture, men more reasonable, women more emotional. So you had this whole idea connecting to women. There were men accused of witchcraft, but it was mostly women. And so here you have some of the ideas where you start now crossing humans and animals. Animals being, the opposite of civilization, animals being closely tied to, let's say, what is more raw, negative, and then this is kind of tied into this image of the devil. We had this a little bit in the imagery associated with Satanism last week, and so you see some of these traditional drawings where there's these half woman, half animal, associated with these ideas of witchcraft. So why women? Well, women were usually associated with being involved in those times in life where you were kind of on the verge, on the boundaries between life and death. They were midwives. They were, kind of in charge of either, a child being born or something bad happening. They were often associated with healing. And so being able to use traditional plants was a dangerous thing. And so the belief that women could use this power to cause problems, was very, very common. Again, here you go, women considered weak, susceptible to the devil's advances, kind of the weaker sex, but yet still having this, sexual power, sexual drive, and then that whole kind of marginal space that women would embody would really suscept them to accusations of witchcraft. So here's the whole idea of the witch on the broom. Here's some texts that are tied to, pre-Christian ideas that witches would travel at night and would cause their harm at night, and so that's how they would travel. There is I don't know if the presentation is going to talk about the cult of Diana. So the cult of Diana was this idea that women would leave their bodies at night and engage in revelry and enjoyment and celebration, maybe cause a little ruckus and then come back into their bodies before the morning. So lots of these different images and interpretations. Here you have naked, you have, the raw of being naked and female and sexual, and this half animal, half human state was all tied to this notion of diabolical witchcraft. You can see some more of these. So you had a lot of things going on. You had the Reformation going against Catholicism. You had a lot of religious wars at this time. And so the whole idea is looking at traditional healing or midwives, or these people that might be tied to pre-Christian beliefs or pre-Christian practices, were the focus of this persecution. Both, it ended up, Protestants and Catholics were persecuted. Sometimes several members of the family were accused of witchcraft. This included in secular as well as religious or ecclesiastical courts. And it was a crime legally, but also in terms of religion, it was a sin. And so how did someone have to prove, who was a witch? It's the same kind of idea with do you give the poison to the chicken and does it die? Then it's, your answer is true. So you torture people and they're going to tell you what you want to hear. And that was a really big part of these witch trials as well. So witchcraft trials ended, and what happened? And like I mentioned a couple slides ago, the Age of Enlightenment really shifted this. Rationalism was coming to replace unquestioned faith and authority of church and state, and people started to look at humans in a very different way. You had the Romantic Age soon following, Darwin, science, theory of evolution, really changing the way that people looked at the world and looked at science, and this kind of, went away. we're going to skip the Industrial Revolution. So finally, Neo-Paganism, kind of our third interpretation of witchcraft. I'm going to leave it to the presentation this week, looking at the idea of modern witches called Wicca, or the Wicca religion. And Neo-Paganism is a form of witchcraft, but not all witches or Wicca practitioners are Neo-Pagans. Neo-Pagans are looking at a new interpretation of pre-Christian or pagan religious beliefs and practices, and usually this is very nature-based. So we'll see what the group is going to tell us this week about this particular aspect of witchcraft. I thank you for your time. I'm sorry I'm late in posting all this because I'm a little sick, but I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Have a great couple of days. All right.